Imagine scrambling a multi-million-dollar supersonic fighter jet just to shoot down a slow, remote-controlled airplane that costs, less than a used smartphone. It sounds like a catastrophic math error, but that upside-down financial equation is exactly what is bankrupting modern air defense systems right now. Welcome to the Clara and Horatio Daily World Brief, available at claraandhoratio.com. As of our episode date, August 16th, 2026, the entire strategic landscape of aerial warfare in Eastern Europe has crossed a staggering new threshold. Over the weekend, Ukraine launched an unprecedented drone assault, sending 822 drones deep into Russian territory, with 600 of those aimed directly at the Moscow region.
The sheer volume of that assault represents a fundamental shift in military capability.
Hmm.
We're looking at a sustained, highly coordinated effort to bring the physical reality of the conflict directly into Russia's logistical and civilian centers. The mayor of Moscow described it as one of the most massive drone attacks in recent memory, one that required an enormous mobilization of their air defense grid.
And the targets reveal a lot about the broader strategy because they were not strictly military installations. A major warehouse belonging to the Russian e-commerce giant Wildberries was hit in Koledino, which is just 25 kilometers from central Moscow, and set completely ablaze. For context, Wildberries is essentially Russia's version of Amazon, so disabling a hub of that size cripples massive segments of civilian and potentially military supply chains.
Which is an intentional overlap. The defense ministry in Kyiv explicitly claims these Wildberries logistics centers are being utilized to supply the Russian army. They state they have now disabled 7 out of 10 of the largest hubs in that specific network.
But the human cost of this escalation across the board remains incredibly severe. Over the last few days, Russian strikes proved fatal for civilians in Zaporizhia and Kryvyi Rih. And in Kyiv, air raid sirens sounded 4 times in a single night, severely damaging a book market in the Pachina district. One vinyl store owner, after losing her entire inventory to the strike, plainly told reporters, "I want Russia to disappear from this earth."
That sentiment really underscores the psychological toll, which is spreading in both directions. The Ukrainian drone strike simultaneously resulted in civilian deaths in Belgorod, where a public bus was struck, and an 83-year-old man died in the Moscow region. The battlefield is clearly stretching across borders, and the physical spillover into neighboring airspace is becoming a severe risk.
Wait, actual spillover into NATO airspace? Because we saw Romania and Latvia actually have to intervene to protect their own skies. A Spanish F-18 fighter jet was forced to shoot down a drone over Romania, and an Italian Eurofighter intercepted another one in Latvian airspace.
Those interceptions illustrate the fundamental crisis in modern defense infrastructure. For years, Ukraine has relied heavily on U.S.-made Patriot interceptor missiles. The problem is that U.S. stockpiles were significantly depleted during its own recent conflict with Iran.
So the U.S. is now highly reluctant to give up more of its remaining arsenal, and has actually denied Ukraine the license to manufacture Patriot missiles locally, which explains why Ukraine is rapidly innovating with homemade drones and, according to their former defense minister, plans to produce domestic ballistic missiles within a tight window of just 3 to 6 months.
Exactly. Meanwhile, on the European side, Germany's Interior Minister Alexander Dobrindt just announced a new drone security research facility at an aerospace center in Saxony-Anhalt, specifically to counter these novel hybrid warfare threats.
But I just cannot wrap my head around the economics of this. If nations are scrambling sophisticated F-18s and firing multi-million-dollar interceptors to destroy basic $1,000 unmanned aerial vehicles, doesn't the attacker win simply by forcing the defender to spend their own money? It feels like the financial math of national defense is fundamentally broken.
The math is entirely inverted. We are looking at an aerial war of attrition designed specifically to paralyze civilian logistics and industrial capacity at a fraction of the cost of defending against it.
So when a $1,000 drone requires a $2 million missile to intercept, the attacker does not even need to hit the target to inflict damage. They just need to bankrupt the defender's arsenal.
Precisely. Dobrindt calling this an arms race in drone technology is highly accurate because the barrier to entry for the offense has plummeted, while the cost of defense remains astronomically high. Traditional air defense systems, massive radar arrays, kinetic interceptors, were built to stop occasional, highly expensive fighter jets, not endless swarms of cheap plastic and circuitry.
Well, that terrifying breakdown in sustainability isn't just happening with hardware in the sky. We are seeing a completely different kind of breaking point regarding the human infrastructure over in the Middle East. High-level diplomacy remains completely gridlocked. Just recently, U.S. President Donald Trump's envoy, Jared Kushner, met with Hamas leader Khalil Ahaya and Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt.
They were attempting to push a 15-point peace plan drafted by the U.S. Board of Peace, which requires the complete disarmament of Hamas and an Israeli withdrawal. The diplomatic maneuvering involves several high-profile figures aiming to decommission weapons and establish a new civilian Palestinian administration.
But the immediate outcome was a total stalemate. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu firmly rejected the plan, demanding that Hamas disarm completely before any IDF withdrawal even occurs.
And that rejection drew swift and severe condemnation from 8 Muslim nations, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Indonesia, who warned that the stance critically threatens any remaining peace efforts. Meanwhile, the death toll in Gaza has now reached an incomprehensible 73,000, with 90% of the population displaced.
So high-level diplomacy seems to be operating in a vacuum while the physical situation continues to deteriorate. And that deterioration extends directly to the military personnel tasked with enforcing this geopolitical stalemate.
Consider the USS Lincoln, an American aircraft carrier currently deployed in the Middle East. As of our recording, it has been at sea for over 240 continuous days without a single port call. That sets a modern-day record for uninterrupted time at sea for a vessel of that class.
If you have ever felt completely burned out after a long work week, try to imagine the conditions on board that ship right now. Reports are leaking out detailing severe strain on the military infrastructure, poor sanitation, broken plumbing, absolute shortages of fresh food, and most alarmingly, sailors attempting to jump overboard to escape the isolation.
It is an operational crisis. 13 Democrats on the Senate Armed Services Committee just sent a letter to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth demanding answers about this deployment. Admiral Brad Cooper visited the vessel and acknowledged that the mental health of the 5,000-person crew is now a critical priority.
The disconnect between policy and reality is glaring, especially when President Trump dismissed the length of the deployment entirely, stating it was not nearly long enough. Maryland Governor Wes Moore called the conditions heartbreaking, and he is correct from a purely operational standpoint as well.
A nuclear-powered warship cannot function if the crew operating it is psychologically compromised by 8 months of sheer isolation.
We tend to track these massive warships like immovable pieces on a global chessboard, calculating their strike ranges and how effectively they enforce blockades. We rarely factor in the psychological breaking point of the 5,000 isolated human beings operating them. When personnel are stretched past their ethical and operational limits, the multi-billion-dollar platform itself becomes a strategic vulnerability. By the way, for more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit clarenhoratio.com.
It perfectly highlights how military readiness and strategic endurance are entirely dependent on human endurance. You cannot separate the machine from the minds running it. The USS George Washington is reportedly heading to replace them, but the damage to morale, retention, and immediate readiness is already done.
And that theme of human limits colliding with technological acceleration brings us to a different kind of systemic pressure happening in the tech sector. Just recently, a 69-year-old retired teacher from Berkeley named Wynne Kaufman became the first person incarcerated for an anti-AI protest.
She was jailed after blocking OpenAI's San Francisco headquarters during a sit-in organized by the group Stop AI. Her incarceration marks a significant cultural flashpoint because of the legal strategy she employed in court. She attempted to argue a necessity defense,
which is traditionally used in extreme physical situations, like breaking into a cabin to survive a blizzard or stealing a car to rush someone to the hospital. You argue that breaking the law was required to prevent a much greater imminent harm. So Kaufman attempted to apply this legal concept to artificial superintelligence, arguing her trespass was necessary to prevent an existential threat to humanity.
The district attorney rejected that argument entirely, stating protesters cannot simply endanger public safety based on technological forecasts. But her underlying warnings are actually aligning with massive anxieties across the political spectrum. U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders recently demanded a strict pause on AI development, citing severe fears regarding the generation of new bioweapons.
Furthermore, over 1,000 researchers signed an open letter warning that capability development is accelerating far beyond human control. Though the internal dynamics of these protest groups are proving highly volatile, Stop AI's co-founder, Sam Kushner, actually went missing after a severe internal dispute over whether the movement should pivot to using violent tactics, reportedly telling colleagues the nonviolent ship has sailed.
That rapid escalation in rhetoric directly mirrors the rapid escalation of the technology itself. Trillion-dollar frontier AI labs are locked in a ruthless geopolitical race for supremacy, terrified of losing ground to international rivals in Beijing.
That international competition creates a massive disincentive for lawmakers in Washington to enact any meaningful safety regulations. They view slowing down as conceding global dominance. And we are already seeing the immediate economic fallout of that unregulated race in the labor market.
Look at Hollywood. A new studio called Promise is utilizing Chinese AI models, specifically one called Seedance 2.5, to generate entirely synthetic sets and actors for an upcoming horror film called Touchgrass.
Let me make sure I understand how this works. They are not just using CGI to touch up a scene. They are taking a human actor's raw movements and superimposing them in real time onto a completely digitally generated field of grass.
Exactly. By bypassing the need for practical shooting locations, lighting rigs, and massive production crews, they are projecting 20 to 50% cuts in production costs. That directly threatens the livelihoods of thousands of below-the-line industry workers.
And the disruption extends far beyond creative entertainment. It strikes at the core of how we assess human competence entirely. Global education systems are fracturing under the weight of this technology. In Mexico, the prestigious UNAM University was forced to make 58,000 students retake their entrance exams due to abnormally high marks and suspected widespread AI cheating.
The tools for deception have moved far beyond written notes on a sleeve. We're talking about highly sophisticated real-time communication with AI via micro-earpieces during the exams.
The panic responses from governments are incredibly telling here. Denmark is now forcing teenagers to verbally defend their written essays in person just to prove they actually authored them. And in Portugal, the education minister, Fernando Alexandre, attempted to fully digitize the exam marking process to handle the load,
Which resulted in disastrous software marking errors and national protests demanding his immediate resignation. In India, the crisis is even more severe and deeply tragic. Massive paper leaks linked to an illicit education mafia, which are essentially organized crime syndicates that steal and sell test access, have caused nationwide protests.
And this movement is being led by the Cockroach Junta Party, a massive grassroots political group pushing back against systemic corruption. The immense pressure and fraud linked to these crucial exams have tragically resulted in more than a dozen student suicides.
It shows how deeply destabilizing this tech is to foundational civic structures.
Releasing this kind of generative AI into the public right now does not feel like a normal tech launch. It is not like dropping a new smartphone into the market. It is exactly like dropping a highly aggressive, invasive species into a fragile ecosystem. There are absolutely no natural predators. You cannot just expect the local school boards, labor markets, and legal systems to magically evolve overnight to survive it.
The invasive species analogy captures the stark contradiction perfectly. You have frontier AI labs operating with near-infinite resources, driven by valuations projected in the trillions, moving at breakneck speed. On the other side, you have civic institutions, from local judges dealing with novel protest defenses to university exam boards trying to digitize grading, that are left completely unequipped to handle the immediate fallout.
Well, that theme of being entirely unequipped for rapid change is not confined to the digital realm. The physical economy and our environment are experiencing massive structural shocks. Germany's automotive industry, which has been a cornerstone of European manufacturing for a century, is undergoing a brutal culling due to fierce competition from Chinese electric vehicle makers.
The numbers reflect a deep, historic structural crisis. BMW is cutting up to 8,000 jobs globally. Porsche is eliminating 5,000 positions in Germany. Volkswagen, Europe's largest car maker, is planning to slash up to 100,000 roles and is seriously considering closing 4 of its German factories.
To put the scale of that inefficiency in perspective, Volkswagen employs around 630,000 people globally. That is 60% more personnel than Toyota, despite the fact that both companies produce roughly the same number of vehicles annually.
The cost structures of these heritage industries simply cannot compete when German factory operating costs are frequently twice those of their international rivals. Even Mercedes-Benz, which officially ruled out compulsory redundancies, was forced to write off roughly $750 million due to fierce competition in China.
Which is why they postponed bonus payments for their German workforce until 2027 and proposed extending the work week to 40 hours without any extra pay. And the economic vulnerability of these heritage industries perfectly mirrors their environmental vulnerability. Germany's agriculture is buckling under climate extremes.
Late June heat waves exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, caused total crop failures in corn. The biological timing of that heat wave was devastating.
Because the extreme heat coincided exactly with the brief flowering period of the corn. If the temperatures are too high during those specific days, the pollination fails completely, preventing any cobs from forming.
We are seeing the compounding effects of long-term climate shifts directly interacting with acute, localized weather events. European grain forecasts have been slashed, costing over $2 billion in losses. Farmers are being forced to adapt at an unnatural speed, shifting to early maturing barley, experimenting with French wheat genetics, and even planting crops like soybeans and millet.
Fruit farmers are resorting to using hail protection nets as makeshift sunshades and testing semi-transparent photovoltaic films just to keep their crops from burning. Across Europe, the physical threat to populations from unpredictable weather is escalating rapidly. Deadly wildfires recently struck the Greek island of Salamina, breaking out simultaneously in two separate locations.
The blazes left 2 people dead and forced hundreds of residents to evacuate entirely by sea. Copernicus, the EU's climate monitoring service, confirmed that Western Europe just experienced its hottest June to July period on record. The baseline for what we consider normal weather is simply gone.
Yet, if we contrast this intense global warming pressure with localized conservation policy in the United States, we see a fascinating imbalance in how time works. In Florida, sea turtle nests have hit absolute record highs. We are talking about over 13,000 loggerhead nests counted along an 8.5-mile stretch in Juno Beach, with another record broken on Sanibel Island.
That conservation success is the direct, undeniable result of decades of strict protection under the 1973 Endangered Species Act. It takes sea turtles 20 to 30 years just to reach reproductive maturity.
Meaning, the mother turtles returning to nest on those beaches today are the direct beneficiaries of policies enacted before they were even born. They are surviving because of protected habitats, meticulous rescue programs like the Responsible Pier Initiative, which operates on 79 piers around the country, and strict restrictions on hunting.
Justin Perot from the Loggerhead Marine Life Center pointed out that these mother turtles do an astonishing amount of heavy lifting, laying multiple nests in a single season, and then requiring 2 to 3 years completely off just to biologically recover.
But here's where the timeline mismatch becomes highly dangerous. It takes 30 years of patient, meticulous conservation to recover a complex species like the sea turtle. Yet, recent rollbacks of the Endangered Species Act by the Trump administration threaten to functionally erase those gains.
Because those rollbacks give outsized deference to economic considerations to favor oil drilling, mining, and rapid commercial development.
It is a severe imbalance. It takes 30 years of patient conservation to recover a species, but those gains can be functionally erased overnight by a single short-term policy shift. When you connect these distinct threads, a clear pattern emerges regarding stability.
Whether we are looking at century-old German automakers facing rapid technological displacement or ancient marine ecosystems facing abrupt legislative rollbacks, systems that rely on long-term stability are fundamentally unprepared for the accelerated shocks of the 2026 landscape. Resilience requires time, but the current pressures are stripping time out of the equation entirely.
To close out today's briefing, I want to leave you with a historical reflection that brings these recurring themes of labor, technology, and systemic exploitation full circle. Think about vanilla. It is the second most expensive spice in the world, routinely selling for hundreds of dollars a kilo. Yet its history is completely intertwined with unrecognized human ingenuity.
The Totonac and Aztec people originally cultivated vanilla in Mesoamerica, using it as a highly sacred tribute. But when the Spanish brought the creeping orchid vine back to Europe and colonial administrators attempted to spread it to places like India and Java to grow it for profit, they faced a massive biological problem.
The vines grew beautifully, but they produced absolutely no vanilla pods. Because for 3 centuries, European botanists could not figure out how to cultivate the orchids outside of Mexico. They lacked the natural pollinator, a specific stingless bee called the Melipona bee, which Charles Morin finally identified in 1836.
Morin figured out how to manually pollinate the flowers in a lab, but the process was agonizingly slow and impossible to scale for commercial agriculture. The breakthrough didn't come from a prestigious university or a heavily funded European botanical garden.
The breakthrough happened in 1841. A 12-year-old enslaved boy named Edmond Albius, living on the French colony of Reunion Island, solved the centuries-old puzzle. He invented a remarkably simple, brilliant method to hand-pollinate the orchids. Using just his thumb and a tiny sliver of bamboo, he lifted the delicate flap inside the flower, pressing the male and female parts together.
His single, rapid innovation created a multi-billion-dollar global industry. It deeply enriched the French colonial empire, fundamentally shifted the agricultural trajectory of entire nations, and allowed Madagascar to become the world's largest vanilla producer, a title it still holds today.
Yet Edmund Albius died in deep poverty in 1880. He was completely uncompensated for inventing the technique that remains the universal standard in the vanilla industry to this day.
It really highlights how massive global industries have a habit of erasing the individuals who actually built them from the ground up. A botanist even attempted to steal the credit for Albius's discovery at the time, underscoring how power systems attempt to rewrite the origins of their own wealth.
And when chemists eventually synthesized artificial vanillin in 1874, it made the flavor cheap and ubiquitous, altering its cultural meaning entirely so that the word vanilla now just means plain or boring to most people.
Even though the real bean contains over 200 incredibly complex aromatic compounds.
It leaves you with a question to mull over as we watch both the physical and digital world shift so violently around us. Who is actually doing the foundational work of our era, and who is ultimately positioned to capture the reward? For more daily world briefs and classic audiobooks, visit clarinhoratio.com.